You keep failing the morning. Not failing at mornings. Failing the morning. The ritual. The expectation. The unspoken rule that a serious person rises before the sun and produces something before most people have opened their eyes. You've tried. You set the alarm. You've downloaded the apps, read the books, followed the routines of people who swear by 5 a.m. And for a few days, maybe even a week, you force it. You drag yourself out of bed into a cold kitchen and sit there staring at a blank screen or a journal that says nothing to you, waiting for the version of yourself that was supposed to show up. That version doesn't come. What comes instead is a low hum of resistance. Not tiredness, not laziness, but something more specific. A wrongness. Your body and your mind both seem to know something is off.
You have
The
no
way
choice.
you know when a shoe is on the wrong foot. You keep going. You push through. Because the alternative is admitting that you are one of those people, the ones who can't commit, who lack discipline, who talk about changing but never actually do it. So you try again the next week, and the week after that, and every time it falls apart, you add another entry to the case file you've been building against yourself for years. Undisciplined, inconsistent, lazy. That word, lazy. You've heard it from others, but more damaging than anything anyone else has said is the fact that you've started to believe it yourself. It has settled into how you explain your failures, how you preempt criticism, how you start sentences. I know I'm bad about this, but you've made it part of your identity. Here's what nobody told you. The word isn't just wrong. It's pointing at the wrong thing entirely. What you've been calling a character flaw has a biological name, a documented mechanism, and a measurable effect on performance. And the people who designed the schedule you keep failing were never designing it for a mind like yours. This didn't start in adulthood. Go back far enough and you'll find the origin of this problem somewhere in the architecture of a school day that began at 7:30 in the morning. A schedule designed not around human development or cognitive performance, but around agricultural calendars and industrial workforce needs. You were 8, maybe 9, and already someone was noting that you seemed foggy in the morning, slow to engage, hard to reach before 10 a.m. Teachers mentioned it. Parents mentioned it. You need to go to bed earlier. As if the problem were simply a matter of discipline, of choosing wrongly, of not wanting it enough. The message was clear. Even then, the morning people were the right kind of people. The ones who bounced out of bed were organized, ambitious, ready. The ones who didn't were something else, something that needed to be corrected. So the correction efforts began, and they have continued in various forms for most of your life. In school, it was detention for tardiness and poor early class performance. In college, it was the roommate who was already at the library at 7 while you were still unreachable. In your career, it became the 9 a.m. meeting that you physically attend, but mentally arrive at around 11. The performance reviews that noted your slow start to the day. The manager who asked if you were getting enough sleep, meaning, are you taking this seriously? And in your personal life, it became the partner who called you a night owl, like it was a quirk. The friends who stopped inviting you to early weekend plans. The family members who still, to this day, make a small comment when you mention you slept past 8. The accumulation of that is not small. It is years of evidence built brick by brick that you do not function the way you are supposed to function. And at some point, you internalize the verdict before anyone else had to deliver it. Now hear the internal monologue. This is what runs when the alarm goes off and the body refuses. Just get up. Other people get up. You always do this. You set this alarm on purpose, and now you're going to waste the whole morning again. You had a plan. You always have a plan. Why can't you just follow through for once? This is why things don't work out for you. This is the thing that's always been wrong. You don't want it enough. If you wanted it enough, this wouldn't be a problem. Successful people don't do this. Get up. You're doing it again. You're failing again. You are, once more, proving yourself right. That monologue is not motivational. It is corrosive, and it runs on repeat, not just at the alarm, but at every meeting you arrive to slightly slower than you should, every morning where the work doesn't get done because the mind isn't there yet, every day that begins with a quiet humiliation nobody else can see. Now watch what happens when you try to suppress this entirely, when you white-knuckle it into compliance. You set an aggressive schedule. Do you follow it for 3 days? On the 4th day, the exhaustion is real. Not ordinary tiredness, but the specific fatigue of sustained biological misalignment, of forcing your system into a state it hasn't consented to. You crash. You sleep in. You spend 2 days recovering. And then comes the interpretation. This is who you are. This is the pattern. You are someone who cannot be trusted with a schedule. But that interpretation is missing the central fact. You didn't fail to comply with a good schedule. You failed to sustain a schedule that was physiologically incompatible with you from the start. The experiment was flawed. The conclusion you drew from it was not. And this is where the real question surfaces. Not the one you've been asking. Not why can't I make myself do this? The real question, the one underneath all of this, is harder. If the schedule I've been measured against was never built for me, what would it look like if I built one that was? That is not a comfortable question, because answering it honestly requires you to stop apologizing for your biology and start taking it seriously. Point 1. Dismantle the label. Lazy is a behavioral conclusion drawn from an incomplete observation. It is what you call a person when you see them not doing something and you lack or don't bother to seek the context for why. It assumes that the failure to produce is a failure of will, that desire is the missing variable, that the person could do the thing if they simply cared enough to do it. None of that applies to you. Not because your will is strong, though it may be, but because the observation that led to the conclusion was made at the wrong time of day. Imagine evaluating a surgeon's capability by asking them to perform an operation under conditions they specifically weren't trained for, in a room with inadequate lighting, on 3 hours of sleep, at a time of day when their hands reliably shake, then concluding, from that performance, that they are incompetent. That is the precision of the diagnosis that has been applied to you. Chronobiology, the scientific study of biological time, has documented what are called chronotypes, genetically and neurologically determined patterns that govern when your body and brain are primed for alertness, creativity, decision-making, and physical output. These are not preferences. They are physiological states driven by cortisol rhythms, core body temperature fluctuations, and melatonin timing, all of which vary meaningfully and measurably between individuals. Roughly 40% of the population has a later chronotype, meaning their biology does not reach full cognitive readiness until mid to late morning at the earliest, and reaches peak performance in the afternoon or evening. For these people, the early morning is not a time of possibility. It is a time of neurological deficit. Lazy is the wrong word. The right word is misaligned. Point 2. The real origin. Where does this pattern come from? And what is it actually doing? Your chronotype is largely determined by genetics, specific variants in circadian clock genes, including PER3, clock, and CRY1, are directly correlated with sleep timing and alertness windows. This is not a recent discovery. Circadian research has been accumulating for decades, and in 2017, the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine was awarded to 3 scientists for their work on the molecular mechanisms controlling it. The science is not fringe. The problem is that the science and the culture have not yet reached a working agreement. Your brain during its off-peak hours is not simply slower. It is differently configured. Prefrontal cortex activity, the part of the brain responsible for executive function, decision-making, and sustained concentration, is measurably reduced in off-peak periods. The cognitive work that feels effortless at 8 p.m. for you is genuinely neurologically harder at 8 a.m. You are not imagining the resistance. You are measuring real friction between your biological state and the task at hand. The function this pattern serves is not avulus idence. It is conservation. Your system is protecting peak resources for peak hours. When you override that conservation, when you force output during deficit hours, day after day, you are not building discipline. You are depleting a resource that is finite in any given day, and you are producing lower quality output than you would if you had simply waited. Your chronotype is not a liability disguised as a quirk. It is a biological operating system running exactly as designed. Point 3. What the judgment reveals. Examine the people who have judged you for this, not to dismiss them, but to understand precisely what they are doing when they call you lazy, unfocused, or undisciplined for not matching their schedule. What they are doing, in most cases, is mistaking their experience for the universal standard. The early riser who feels clarity at 6 a.m. and has structured their identity around that clarity has no frame of reference for what it is like to be a different kind of nervous system. They know with genuine conviction that the morning works. They cannot fully imagine that it genuinely does not work for someone else, because for them, the only explanation for not making it work would be a failure of effort. They are not lying. They are extrapolating from their own experience and arriving at a judgment that feels entirely logical from where they stand. But that judgment reveals something important. It reveals a person who has never been seriously required to question whether their own default experience is universal. People who have always fit the dominant schedule rarely examine the schedule itself. They have no reason to. It has never cost them anything. The criticism says less about your discipline than it does about their imagination. Point for the concrete advance. When you stop forcing your peak cognitive resources into off-peak hours and start sitting them for the windows when they are actually available, the output changes, not marginally, but substantially. Research into creative cognition has found that complex problem-solving, divergent thinking, and insight-based work tend to occur more readily when the brain is in a state of broad, diffuse activation, rather than the narrow, executive-driven focus of a performance state. For later chronotypes, that diffuse, generative state often arrives in the evening hours, a time when the culture has already labeled them wasted or unproductive. This is precisely when many late chronotypes do their best thinking, produce their strongest creative work, and solve problems that resisted them all day. They are doing this, typically in secret, after the world has gone to bed and stopped watching. The advantage is not small. Studies on chronotype-matched scheduling, where individuals were allowed to schedule demanding cognitive tasks during their personal peak hours, showed performance improvements of 20 to 30% on complex tasks compared to chronotype mismatch conditions. 20 to 30%. That is not a rounding error. That is the difference between a good outcome and an exceptional one, and it is being surrendered every day by people who are performing at a disadvantage they were never told they had a choice about. When your schedule matches your biology, you do not become a different person. You become an accurate version of who you already are. Point 5. Suppressed versus used BS. Point 5. Suppressed versus used strained. There are two versions of this trait, and they look completely different. The suppressed version looks like this. You force yourself into a schedule that doesn't match your neurological rhythm, produce mediocre output at the wrong time, exhaust yourself trying to look productive during hours when your brain is actively working against you, arrive at your actual peak hours depleted, and confirm, again, that you cannot get things done. Then you interpret the failure as evidence of your character, rather than evidence of the mismatch. This is the version most people with a later chronotype are living in. It is not a character flaw producing the failure. It is a structural error being misread as a personal one. The used version looks different. It looks like someone who has stopped negotiating with a system that was never designed for them. and started designing their days around the actual data of their own performance. They protect their peak hours with discipline, real discipline, not the performance of discipline. They do not apologize for when they work. They evaluate themselves not on when the work happened, but on whether the work was any good. The used version produces more, not because they are trying harder, because they stopped trying at the wrong time. Suppression is not discipline. Suppression is waste. The first and most consequential change is not behavioral. It is linguistic, because the language you use internally determines what you are able to see, and right now the language you are using is actively blinding you to what is actually happening. Every time you say lazy, replace it with misaligned. These are not synonyms. Lazy implies the problem is will. Misaligned implies the problem is fit, and fit can be corrected by changing the environment, not the person. That is not a small distinction. It is the entire difference between a solvable problem and a character indictment. Every time you say, I can't make myself do this, replace it with this hour is wrong for this task. Notice what changes. The first sentence confirms a failure of self. The second sentence identifies a scheduling error. One of those sentences has a solution. The other one doesn't. Every time you say, I'm not a morning person, which, carries the cultural weight of an admission, replace it with my cognitive peak is in the afternoon, or the evening, or whenever yours actually is, and say it as a fact, not an apology. Because it is a fact. Your brain has a measurable performance curve. You are simply naming it. The language you choose is not cosmetic. It is structural. It determines whether you are a person with a character problem or a person with a scheduling problem. Only one of those is fixable. Look at your current environment and ask a single question about each element of it. Does this allow me to function at my actual peak, or does it require me to function at someone else's? Not every environment can be reshaped. Some jobs have fixed hours. Some obligations are non-negotiable. But most people underestimate how much flexibility exists within their constraints because they have never actually mapped them. They have accepted the default without auditing whether the default serves them. So do the audit. Identify the 3 to 5 hours in your day when your cognition is sharpest, when decisions come easily, when problems feel tractable, when the work has momentum. Write those hours down. Then, look at your current schedule and identify what those hours are currently used for. If your peak hours are being spent on email, administrative tasks, or low-stakes work that could happen at any time of day, that is not a productivity problem. That is a resource allocation problem. Protect the peak. Do the hardest, most demanding, most important work during the hours when you are most equipped to do it. Reserve the shallow work for the hours when your brain is less available. This is not a radical idea. It is what high performers in cognitively demanding fields do intuitively. They are not necessarily more disciplined than you. They have simply built environments that do not require them to perform. While misaligned and beyond your own schedule, examine which relationships in your life reinforce the wrong narrative. The people who comment on when you sleep, who express judgment about your hours, who treat your schedule as evidence of a character flaw. These people are not helping you perform better. They are increasing the cognitive overhead of self-management. You do not need to remove them from your life, but you do need to stop updating your self-assessment based on their observations. The next time someone makes a comment, a colleague, a family member, a partner, about your schedule, your sleep, or your productivity habits, you need a prepared internal response. Not for them, for you. Because the damage of those moments is not the comment itself. It is what you do with the comment internally for the next 3 hours. Here is the 2-sentence internal response. That observation is based on a schedule that was never built for my chronotype. Tells me about their default, not my deficiency. Say those 2 sentences to yourself before you respond to them. Or don't respond at all. What you are doing is inserting a correction between the comment and your internalization of it. Without that correction, external judgments get processed as evidence. With it, they get processed as data about the observer's framework, not a verdict about your character. You don't need to argue with them. You don't need to explain chronobiology over dinner. You just need to stop letting their certainty override yours. There is a version of accepting your chronotype that looks like resignation. I guess I'm just a night person, said with a slight drop in the voice, the way you concede a point in an argument you've already lost. That is not what is being described here. Ownership looks different. It looks like someone who has done the work of understanding how their mind actually functions, who has made deliberate decisions about their environment and schedule based on that understanding, and who evaluates themselves by the quality and consistency of their output, not by when it occurred. Ownership means that when someone implies your schedule is a problem, the honest response inside your head is not defensive. It is something closer to, I have already solved this. My peak hours are protected. The output is there. The comment is irrelevant to my performance. That is not arrogance. Arrogance requires insecurity underneath it. Ownership requires only accuracy, an honest assessment of how you function best, and a commitment to building around that reality rather than against it. The person who owns their chronotype does not feel the need to justify it. They have already accounted for it. The judgment arrives too late to matter. You are not asking permission to work differently. You are simply working differently and letting the results make the case that no amount of explanation ever could. There is a larger pattern underneath all of this, and it is worth naming directly. You have been measuring yourself against a standard that was never calibrated to you. It was calibrated to an idealized worker, one imagined by industrial-era productivity culture as someone who arrives early, outputs continuously, and produces on a fixed, visible, externally legible schedule. That worker was never real. The standard was not derived from human performance data. It was derived from what an employer could monitor, what was observable, what could be counted, what could be penalized when absent. And you have been judging your own worth against a metric designed for surveillance, not for output, for presence, not for performance, not for appearing productive, not for being productive. You have spent years building a case against yourself, NG evidence that was collected under the wrong conditions, evaluated against the wrong standard, and interpreted through a framework that had no room for biological variation. Every failure you cataloged, every morning you judged yourself for, every time you accepted the word lazy as an accurate description, that was not self-awareness. That was self-prosecution, and the verdict was wrong. Here is what is actually true about you right now. You are not someone who lacks the capacity for discipline. You are someone who has been asked to perform a specific kind of discipline, external, schedule-driven, time-stamped discipline that runs against the grain of your neurology. And you have been doing it anyway, imperfectly, expensively, at real cost to your output and your self-perception. That is not the behavior of someone who doesn't care. That is the behavior of someone who has been trying to comply with a standard that was working against them and who kept trying anyway because they believed the failure was theirs. The discipline is already in you. It has just been deployed against yourself rather than for yourself. The effort you have poured into forcing mornings, into building routines that don't fit, into performing productivity at the wrong time of day, that effort is real. It is not wasted, but it has been aimed at the wrong target. What changes now is not how hard you work. What changes is what you stop fighting. You stop fighting your biology, your peak hours, your natural rhythm, and you start fighting for them instead. You protect them. You build around them. You measure yourself by what happens during them, not by whether you were visible and producing at 7 in the morning when your cortisol was low and your prefrontal cortex was 3 hours from waking up. Your mind works. You have simply been testing it on the wrong exam, at the wrong time, and calling the score your final grade. The schedule was wrong, not you.